for this talk, what we mean by privacy is data privacy or information privacy, online privacy. So what got me interested in this area is that privacy is both a social problem and a technological / mathematical problem. And being a social problem, you naturally have different views on privacy. What does privacy mean to you? And one view is exemplified by the following statement, which is privacy is no longer a social norm. Like people used to care about privacy, but now everybody shares everything and no one cares. And this statement, maybe not surprisingly, was said by Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook. But maybe on the other extreme, a different view is exemplified by the following quote, which is, I believe privacy-focused communications platform will become even more important than today's open platforms. Okay, any guesses who said this quote? Also Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, so what's the difference between these two is just 9 years, between 2010 and 2019. And what happened between these 2 years is that several scandals and much bigger awareness globally of the importance of privacy and the dangers of privacy violations. I'll give you just a few examples. So this was 9 years ago where Facebook conducted an experiment on their users by saying, can they change their moods? Can they make them a little bit happier, a little bit more anxious, a little bit sadder, by just changing what feed they show them. So they change the Facebook feed and see how it affects them. And maybe not surprisingly, it turns out that they can affect the moods of their users. And this experiment was conducted without the users knowing it's being conducted. Okay. And more recently, there was a much bigger scandal in 2016, which you might have heard about if you were following the US elections at the time, which is related to a company called Cambridge Analytica, which harnessed the data of 50 million Facebook users in order to create specified targeted ads that will influence their decisions during elections. Okay, and we see these kinds of data being used against users in many ways, including, for example, recently by governments to identify anti-government activists, or let's say pro-Palestinian activists, and so on. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of the importance of privacy, we actually realize that privacy is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we do not have a clear understanding of how data fits in that picture. But more recently, Europe, there is a European law called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which enforces how data should be handled online and gives back to the user control over their data. Okay, so how do you model this from an engineering perspective? We'll show a very simple model. You have two entities. One entity has data and is interested in some service, and another entity is willing to provide the service and is interested in the data. So, for example, you are a Facebook user, you want the Facebook service to be able to post, to connect to friends, and what they want is your data so that they can sell it to ad providers. Okay? But this applies to many other contexts like Google or Twitter and so on. Now, for this talk, I'm going to slightly change the setup and say instead of one user with their own data, what we have is a private database. So it's a collection of users, and they were storing all their private data in one database. You can think of this as some hospital records, for instance. So they should be private. But at the same time, hospital records are very important for medical research. We don't want to hide them. People need to investigate these records. They want to study correlations. Are certain medications useful, and so on. So how can we do this? How can we make this data available for research, but at the same time not violate the privacy of the users? If you're like me and maybe most others, at first glance, this looks like a trivial problem. Okay, just publish this data, but remove any identifying information. Don't put names, don't put IDs, don't put addresses. Okay, cool. And it turns out things are more simple because that's exactly what they did in Massachusetts in 1997. They published hospital records, anonymized, no names, no addresses, but it has zip code, so the area of the patient, and gender, birth date, in addition to diagnosis and so on. And then one researcher at MIT called Latanya Sweeney bought the voter registration records for like $10. You can buy these, and they have an overlap in the data in addition to name and address. But they also have zip code, gender, and birth date. And it turns out that from these three entries, you can most of the time determine exactly who the person is. And And then what Sweeney did was actually find the record of the governor of Massachusetts, and she made it his medical record. Okay, so that's a funny surprise. Okay, and a similar problem happened with Netflix a few years later, where they published an anonymized database, but again, the publishing was not successful, was not really anonymous, and they were sued. Okay, so in most of these examples, we publish an entire database, so we can say, okay, I want to have more control. I'm not going to publish the entire database. I'm going to say, I'm going to keep my data for myself, and anybody who wants to use it, they can query, and I will answer them. Okay, you want to find out what is the correlation between a certain medication and a certain disease, I will compute it for you and I'll give you the answer. Okay? Sounds fair enough, and again you think, okay, now the problem is again trivial. How to preserve privacy? Just don't answer overly specific queries. Like somebody asks, like, what is the diagnosis of Ibrahim Issa? Don't answer. But any group queries, other overall statistics is fine. Okay? Turns out, again, not fine. As an example, let's say you query the AUB database, like what is the average salary of an ECA professor? And you get back an answer, 70K. I don't know if that's real, just a number. Okay? Well, what's the problem? Okay. From this number, you cannot deduce any salary. We have like 30 professors, right? But the issue is, suppose the analyst asks this question in fall 2018, and then they ask again in spring 2019, and they get a different answer. Why did they get a different answer? Because I joined the department. Okay? So from these two numbers, they can exactly get my salary. Okay? And I don't want to reveal my salary in general. So it's again a privacy violation. What's the takeaway from all of these examples is that we really cannot have like ad hoc measures to preserve privacy. We need a systematic approach, a mathematical model. And this is like the first big hurdle in privacy research, like how do you properly model privacy? And there have been over 80 attempts. Okay, you can find over 80 definitions in the literature. I'll talk about the most successful one, which is called differential privacy, which again looks at the model where you are querying the database. And what it says, like, your system is private if it satisfies the following constraint. Okay? It says, okay, if an analyst queries a query, let's call it Q, the question, compute something, and let's say later the database changes by one slight change, one entry changes. For example, I was not in the department, and then I joined the department. One entry change. And then the querier asks the same question, and then they get another answer, B. So what differential privacy imposes is that the answers A and B are, if there is a change, it's undetectable. Okay? What does that really mean? Like if there are two numbers, what does it mean that you cannot detect the difference between two numbers? Well, this is where it comes in, which is slightly unintuitive, is that we are going to use randomization. So I no longer have a fixed answer. I intentionally introduce noise. So this might sound a little bit weird, so it's worth repeating. So we're saying when the query asks a question, when the analyst asks a query to the database will compute the true answer and then intentionally add noise. Why are we doing this? Because we have conflicting goals. On the one hand, we want to give a useful answer. On the other hand, I want to preserve privacy. So what this noise is doing is hiding the difference between the two real answers. So crucially, the parameter or the variance of the noise you are adding has to depend on what kind of question is being asked. Okay? And please, slightly more technical, if you will allow me, that what differential privacy guarantees is that if an answer was unlikely previously in the database, after the database changes, the answer remains unlikely. Okay? All right, so the takeaway from this is that we have to use randomization in order to preserve privacy. There is no way to answer things exactly and preserve privacy, so we have a privacy accuracy trade-off. If you want more privacy, you have to sacrifice some accuracy and vice versa. Right? And this is where a big chunk of the research that is happening is at the trade-off of privacy and accuracy, because this also factors in private machine learning. Okay, how do we get a certain level of accuracy? What is the privacy of the data? Okay, so let me finally talk about our own contribution. So this is a joint work that has been published actually with an AUB undergraduate student. where we looked at upgrading the framework of differential privacy. And of course, we are inspired by the initial constraint, which says any unlikely answer should remain unlikely. So this is looking at ratio. So if the probability was small before, the new probability should be again small. We're looking at the ratio. And so it makes sense to look also at the difference, in the sense that for any probability should not change by much. Okay? The probability of any answer. So you can think of this as, this is looking at the relative change of the likelihood of answering, and this is looking at the absolute change. Okay, so and we argue that we can control both. Yeah, and we're not saying controlling the absolute change is better. We're saying you can control both at the same time, and this will give you a richer profile of privacy, and will allow you a better study of the privacy utility framework. That's it.